I literally step off the plane. I meet up with a couple of friends. We turn left on Monument Ave, and a bunch of dudes are stars and bars and like guns, like walking around. Like they're reenactors basically, and they're walking around from the VMFA, and they're at the Robert E. Lee Chapel, and all this stuff is just going on. I'm like, what?
Welcome to Virginia.
Hi, I'm Aaron Anderson, and this is the Reinvention podcast. This is my show about extraordinary, ordinary people who have changed their lives or changing the direction in their lives in some way. I'm joined here by Tara Cortland, a recovering news junkie and journalist, and probably one of the smartest people I know. We are together in this room because our families are quarantining together. So all the germs that are in here are already in here. Would you call it? Germ pod?
Germ pod.
Germ
pod, but I like quarantine sounds nicer.
Quarantine is good.
Germ pod sounds kind of like you've got the plague already.
And we are joined here today by Ace Callwood and Aaron Montgomery. And so, Tara, do you know them?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I thought they were old guys.
They are old guys.
You said they were entrepreneurs and very impressive,
Yeah.
And so I was picturing old men with beards.
Oh, well, okay. I guess
We'll have to talk about that today too.
Yeah, it's good. So,
I just shaved my beard. There's a story behind that.
Did you? I'm growing a man mane. You like this?
I'm here for it.
It's good. It's good.
It's upside down.
He talks about it a lot.
I do.
You get to do a whole episode about your beard.
Yeah. It's my new hobby is not to shave.
It's true.
Okay. So
and to talk about it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, everybody needs a hobby. So both Ace and Aaron are work at Virginia Commonwealth University as instructors, as I do. They're also both entrepreneurs. Ace is and they both work for their speakers with the Evolve Speaker Network, which is owned by the essentially the company that owns the studio that we're now in, and. Ace is also a consultant, entrepreneur, innovation expert. He was the director of communications. Well, he is now the director of communications at the Health Innovation Consortium at VCU. I showed you the video of him decontaminating masks at the hospital. And he was he was co-chair of the Virginia Governor's Council on Youth Entrepreneurship. Did I get all that right, Ace?
As far as I can remember.
Yeah. And he's just all kinds of cool stuff. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then Aaron has one of those resumes that's just fun to read. So he's co-founder of Carlots, which is essentially like a consignment store for used cars. Is that right?
That's right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And he has, again, and this is the bit, I'm going to read this because it's fun. He has an MBA from Harvard Business School, an applied baccalaureate degree from in economics from Harvard. Plus, he's got loads of awards: Entrepreneur of the Year, Inc. 500, board member for the United Way. He's got one of those resumes that makes me feel like an underachiever.
Stop.
Is that just me?
I'm reading his resume on your screen here, and I think he makes everybody feel like an underachiever.
Yeah. You got to have that a lot. A lot of people.
You should be old, Aaron.
I'm feeling it now.
He's got one of those things, and he ate healthy for breakfast
Right?
too.
Yeah, he ate blueberry yogurt for breakfast.
That's awful.
Rest of us are eating jelly beans.
So
for
anyway,
breakfast.
Tara, Ace, Tara.
Hey.
Hello.
Tara, Aaron, Tara.
Hey.
Ace, Aaron, Ace. You guys know each other though.
We do. We go back.
You go lots of ways back.
We go back.
Yeah, Richmond's a small town, and we're two of the black guys here. So,
Especially when you get confused for one another, it goes. You get close quick.
Yeah. Well, one of you is really, really tall. Ace is, what are you, 6'12"? What are you?
Something like that.
Something like that.
13, I think, if you round up.
And so actually, let's go ahead and let's just jump right in. I have a couple icebreaker questions which are about your business, because all of us are going to do individual talks about business and keynotes and all that sort of stuff. What I really want to talk about, because the world has just gone crazy, but by way of introduction, both of you have some really just fascinating backgrounds. So Ace, if we can start with you for a second, this work you did, I showed Tara the video of the decontamination you did, helping the hospitals decontaminate their masks.
Yeah.
And you ended up doing that in Jeff Davis's old house.
Yep.
So people who watch this podcast may or may not see that. I'll put up the link if possible. But can you how did you start that? How do you learn or come up with the idea of how to decontaminate these masks at a hospital? And how did you end up in the White House of the Confederacy?
Yeah. So I'll clarify a couple things. I'll be the first to say I did not come up with the protocol, nor were we the first ones on this project. And I'll give some quick context there. And then secondly, we're technically in Jeff Davis's backyard. So we're in what
still not allowed in the house, huh?
Nah, still to this day.
Nothing's changed.
I had to shoot emails during that project, and I sat on the front stoop, and with the intention of making him roll over in his grave. So that was the closest I got.
Can I just interject for a second? Because we took our children on a tour of all the monuments before they came down. We figured they're coming down.
Yeah, right.
And we drove by Jeff Davis's house, and we showed him. And my favorite idea, and for those who don't know, Jeff Davis's house, the hospital has actually grown around it. It's
Do
like
Yankees know who Jeff Davis was, first off?
Jeff Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and where his statue used to stand,
There's a basketball hoop.
It's a basketball hoop, and in just beautiful letters it says "Fuck you, Jeff." But the hospital grew up around it, and because they can't move this building, and so the emergency room is right out what Jeff Davis's window would be. And I like to imagine, I told their children that there was a time rift, and Jeff Davis looked out his window one day and he could see into the future, and he could see just how badly they were going to get their asses kicked because they're going to build this emergency room with state-sponsored health care right in his backyard. And it just makes me happy.
Yeah.
Good story.
So the very short on that project is I'm the director of communications at the Health Innovation Consortium, which is a collective, if you will, focused on improving healthcare for patients, providers, and health systems. Our specific focus is doing innovative work. It turns out we've kind of just become really good problem solvers for our founding partner, VCU Health here, which is the area where the White House of the Confederacy is on VCU Health's campus. And through COVID-19, we've kind of become the go-to innovation team to help solve hairy problems facing the health system in a global pandemic. So the decontamination piece, the biggest piece is everybody is trying to figure out PPE, personal protective equipment, specifically the N95 masks that we hear a lot about on the news, or did at least, and the shortages therein. And so when we're planning peak for the health system, one of the considerations is, do we have enough protective equipment for the folks on the front line keeping people healthy? And the projection said that, we probably would not be able to keep stocked because the rest of the world is inhaling masks in the same way that we are. And here's a thing that I learned in this process is manufacturers typically make masks available on allotment, which says you get the average of your last 12 months usage over the course of any given month. And so nobody can keep up with 300, 400, 500% over capacity from a manufacturing standpoint. And so hospitals are trying to figure out how to make their own masks or reuse masks. And that was how VCU Health wanted to tackle that. So supply chain, infection prevention, orthopedic surgery, they brought some of the smartest people around. And then, we are pretty newly formed, and leadership said, hey, we have this team of former entrepreneurs and operators. Can they be an asset to you? And so that's when my longtime co-founder and I at the HIC, along with Dr. Leslie from our team, et cetera, got pulled in. And we were able to look at a couple of things in the facility, optimize the layout. And then one of the big questions is, how do we up throughput? So the idea itself came from University of Nebraska. They put together an awesome protocol. They were able to decontaminate 700 or so masks a day. And the idea was they had clotheslines in a room with a UV light machine that they used to decontaminate hospital rooms. And so you'd hang a bunch of masks on these clotheslines, turn the thing on, shut all the doors. Hopefully you do that in an opposite order, shut the doors and then turn it on. But the idea was you can decontaminate masks with a high dosage or a decent dosage of UV light. Our question was, how do we take this protocol from 700 to, 10,000 or so a day? And one of the suggestions, we kind of put our heads together. I pulled in some students from the Da Vinci Center for Innovation, and we said, if we put the mass on racks and put those racks on wheels. You can prep them in one room, move them into the decon room, and then unload them and return them to the hospital in another room. And so you can up your throughput simply by being efficient with loading, unloading, staging, if you will, and then having a batch that's being decontaminated while you're dealing with prep and unload of the other two. So it was just a really cool project. I'd say the facility itself, the racks, and then the literature. So we had to dig into all of the science to make sure it worked and make the physicians comfortable in the health system. So our team plugged in on most of those things. Dr. Leslie from our team wrote all of the literature, and the facility was up and running in roughly 3 weeks.
Wow.
So we got it up functional, and we can decontaminate something like 20,000 masks a day if we're at full capacity. So really important for us. We're able to do that for some of the police in town, some of the firefighters in town, EMS, and of course our own hospital. And we've been able to take the literature and the document we put together with all of the specs for that operation and pass it on to folks like UVA and Centera, and just sharing it with the health community at large.
Awesome. How did you end up doing that at Jeff Davis's place? Is it just because it was nearby and it was open?
Yeah, proximity. The best way I think I've phrased it is best use of redundant space, if you will. So it is on campus. The museum has since moved down to Tredegar, so that space was open. There were a lot of issues, though. We had to build some walls in, so the facilities ops folks from VCU Health gave us a huge hand. We built some walls. We knocked down some walls. The ventilation sucked, so we had to get some fans and stuff in there. But again, a just crazy turnaround and a collective team effort to get it done.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's cool work that, as a non-healthcare guy, never expected to get to put my hands on.
No, you're making a difference in the world. It's got to feel good.
It is certainly, and they just incredible people to work with. So it's been a good couple months doing work that I never expected to.
That's awesome. And speaking of capitalism, Aaron, how'd you come up with the idea of car lots?
First of all, Aaron, and I'm not going to tell you how to run your show. It's your deal. But if you've got a guy that has created umpteen% more PPE capacity for the world and a guy who sells used cars, start with the used car salesman first. It's like I wanted to make money. I started selling cars. Didn't go. Right? You know what I mean? It's like, wow, what a difference you made, Ace. So Aaron, that's
coming
about your dealership.
That's coming from a guy who's an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. So I'm not buying it, Aaron.
Jeez. Now this one stings, Ace. Buy it or not. I'm feeling small.
Good.
Listen, so we came up with this idea for car lots. The idea for consignment's not new, right? I mean, you've seen it with jewelry, with clothing, with furniture, and people have been doing it forever. Books, I mean, there's tons of wholesale supply chains that just live on consignment. That's not a new thing. But for us in the car space, you just didn't see a ton of it. You'd see cars parked along the highway or along the roads, and they'd have a for sale sign in the window, and it'd sit there, and you'd see it there in the spring, you'd see it there in the summer, and the price would drop, and the tires would get square. But no one would ever buy the car. And you say, that doesn't make any sense. And then you go to a dealership and try to sell your own car, and you see firsthand why they would rather do that than that, because that sucks worse.
Right.
You make a lot less for the car. So the idea was just, if I could set up a dealership that had all the benefits of a store, but sold the car for you at a closer to a price you would have sold it for, then it seems like a win-win. And then it's just a matter of the economics. But the idea itself really wasn't, again, it wasn't that innovative, and it really wasn't this disruptive thing in the way that people might think about it now. I think for me and for us, the real point of that was that the consignment enabled us to do something in the car business that hadn't been done before, or at least not in the way that we went about it. And that was to make it a more pleasant experience on both sides.
That's awesome.
I'll go out, I'll give a talk, and I'll ask a group, and I can do this with 100 people, 1,000 people. It literally doesn't matter. I'll ask the same question. Who's bought a car in the last 5 years? Raise your hand, and all the hands go up, right? And then I'll say, keep your hand up if you had a good experience. And it'll be like 3 hands up. And it doesn't matter the size of the group. It's just, it's always that way. There's always a couple of folks. And then you ask them, well, you had a good experience, but nobody else did. What made yours good? And every single time it's like, well, I knew the dealer. He's my uncle. I just love beating the shit out of salesmen, or I just love cars, right? But there are always these outliers, but everybody else hates it. So it was what was innovative and what was interesting to us was how do I change the incentives? How do I change the compensation structure? How do I change the environment? How do I strip out the artifacts of a traditional dealership and really rethink the entire experience from soup to nuts to really create something different? And that's what was really exciting about the car lot.
And is there's a physical lot where these things are?
Yeah, so we've built these lots. They're all around the country. We've got a couple in Virginia, a couple in North Carolina, and Florida, Texas, Illinois. And what they were is literally just that. It's like it's a dealership where you can bring your car and I'll sell it for you. And the only caveat is that you go to a store, you'll see all of our cars. They still have licenses and things like that because somebody owns them. But it's just like going to a dealership. And the only way you would know that it wasn't a traditional dealership is A, you'd be treated a lot nicer. And B, somebody else is probably pulling up alongside you to drop off their car to sell for them. So, but yeah, that's it. It's a physical marketplace, but it still has those peer-to-peer dynamics that come in from the online marketplaces. And in a world like this, especially right now, in a world where the online marketplace is a bigger part of the presence.
Yeah.
But it started, it was purely a physical dealership that the only caveat was we sell your car for you instead of buying it from you.
That's genius. My wife worked for a consignment shop for a while selling clothes, and I learned about that business model. And it's a brilliant business model, especially for clothes, because if they don't, they put them on the racks. And if they don't sell, then the shop gets to own them. And so it's a great way of getting stuff. I assume you don't get to keep the cars if they don't sell.
Didn't think to design that into the agreements, but I'll go back and revisit. Maybe there's still an opportunity.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So those are just warm-ups. We'll talk about more of that later because it's fascinating, both of those things. But I really want to talk about what's going on in Richmond. If we look outside the windows right now, just down the street to our left, there are some windows broken in some buildings, and of course we have these monuments, these giant monuments, and it's kind of cool being in the School of the Arts. So I work in arts, and the idea that public art has become such a topic is just fantastic to me, and especially to be in Richmond now.
The Black community is happy to have helped your films.
Yeah, that's
there.
good. That was nice.
They're really pleased that they've helped your art.
It was nice.
Era.
It was very nice. I wish maybe I had thought of it sooner, but it turned out it wasn't my idea. But neither of y'all are from Richmond, are you?
No.
Not originally, no.
How did you? So what's your experience been like? Because Richmond is an interesting place for what's going on, sort of an epicenter of the former capital of the Confederacy and all that sort of stuff. But as an outsider to Richmond, what was your experience living in Richmond prior to a couple months ago, and how has it changed, or has it changed? Just your experience here in Richmond as businessmen and people and all that stuff.
I grew up in Detroit. I went to school in Boston. I lived in Atlanta for some time, and I moved to Richmond from Chicago. So I'd only been in these really big, first-tier cities, at least population-wise. They had sports teams. They had, big international
he just
airports.
Called Richmond not a first-tier city. He just dissed my city, man.
I'm just getting started, by the way. But it's just so. Part of me was already prepared for an adjustment in the sense that it's a smaller town, which is fine. I mean, I think there's a lot of charm to go with that, right? So my expectations were that it would be different. But my first trip to Richmond happened to be on Martin Luther King Day, which I learned when I got here is Jackson Lee King Day.
Right. So people who are watching this may not be from Richmond. So can you describe what is King Lee Day?
Yeah, so
you're gonna have to.
So
it's Lee Jackson.
You guys got to say it right.
What is Lee Jackson?
It is
Lee
first
Jackson
off not
King Day,
anymore,
right?
but it was Lee Jackson King Day,
Yeah.
which is
Day?
Yep.
Which even for the people designed it, came up with that name, I think knew that was like the most offensive, stupid ass thing.
So instead of celebrating King Day, they made it Lee Jackson.
Well, it was Lee Jackson Day,
Right.
Jackson Day.
to celebrate Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson.
Right.
And then when Martin Luther King Day became a federal holiday, that was the day we already had in Virginia, Lee Jackson Day. So they just added King to the end. And then somewhere in the 80s, don't quote me on that, they separated the two and said, that's probably offensive. Let's put one on the Friday before.
It wasn't even in the 80s. It was like 5 years ago.
Was it?
that
It was
they
more
separated
recently.
them. It was
Okay,
very
all
recent
right.
that they separated
Well,
them.
yeah, I guess if Aaron, you were getting here on Lee Jackson King Day.
They only added Martin Luther King to this in the I think it was after 2000 when they added it. It was not a long time ago. It was
this just a
recently
Richmond
enough that it's kind of
Virginia.
Yeah,
It's a
to
Virginia
Virginia.
thing.
Yeah, this is a Virginia thing. And they just separated and they just took away Lee Jackson out of it.
And they put it on the Friday preceding Martin Luther King Day.
Right. So if you're a state employee, you've gotten used to now having a 4-day weekend because you get Lee Jackson Day and then you get Martin Luther King Day all across the same weekend. And now you're going to, but that's
And
cool
so, Aaron, when you came from Detroit, you stepped into Lee Jackson King Day.
I literally step off the plane. I meet up with a couple of friends. We turn left on Monument Ave, and a bunch of dudes are stars and bars and like guns, like walking around. Like they're reenactors basically, and they're walking around from the VMFA, and they're at the Robert E. Lee Chapel, and all this stuff is just going on. I'm like, what?
Welcome to Virginia.
Like I'm, again, coming from Chicago, right? And it's like I'd never seen anything. I felt like I'd gone back in time, hit a time warp or something like that. And honestly, the statues I didn't even capture that they were there yet because I was shocked to see people out wearing the gray.
How many years ago was this?
This was 2011.
Oh, so not that long ago.
Not long at all. Not long at all. Yeah, no, this is a recent memory. This is and so that was my context. And then, so then I moved here in the spring of 2011, and I had one of my good buddies from college. I've known this guy for 35 years. We were roommates in college, went to grade school together. So he lived in similar places, except for when I was in Atlanta, he was in LA. So, but the same idea. And he came to visit me in Richmond, and I'm showing him around. And by then it's been 6 or 8 months. I'm more or less accustomed to what's here, and it doesn't pop out the same way. But he hits the ground, and we turn left on Monument Ave. And he's like, what the hell are these statues? And the Stonewall Jackson, especially, he's like, this is giant. Who's this dude on a horse? And I'm explaining to him, and I'm like, damn, this is kind of absurd. Like as I'm saying it, I realize how ridiculous this is. And it was just this cycle after cycle. And then I remember when my wife moved down here, the same thing. And it was always like every single time a new person came in, it snapped me back out of it. Like, oh yeah, this isn't cool. No matter what you think, like this is messed up.
Whoa.
And it was always charged. Every single time it was like a new, oh yeah, you're right. And it finally hit me, I think, not to go too far from your original question, but when it really hit me was when my wife and I wanted to get married. And we wanted to get married in Richmond. She's from New York. I'm from Detroit. We figured everybody's going to have to travel no matter what. So let's get married here. And we looked at the VMFA and we said, we'd like to get married here. We love the place. They said, well, we don't do the weddings here. You can do the reception, but not the wedding. So where do we go for that? So you can go to the Robert E. Lee Chapel. I'm not going to get married. So then we started asking friends, where can we get married? I said, well, you can go to the Sugarfield plantation, or you can go to the Callwood plantation. You go like, no, dude, no, it's not okay that you even suggest that to me.
So the Robert E. Lee Chapel is right behind the museum, right?
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah,
remember I pointed it out. I was like that. I said, I can't believe they didn't tag the chapel.
Right.
They probably didn't know.
They didn't go around that corner. If they'd gone around that corner, they'd have known to tag the chapel.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Let me clarify that the Callwoods don't have a plantation. We have a distillery in St. Thomas, where my family's from. So you want to talk booze, we can talk.
What do you distill?
Rum. It's St. Thomas. Everything
St.
is
Thomas
rum.
rum. Oh, nice.
So it was a sugarcane plantation is what you're saying.
Nice.
I almost went there, and that would have been it. Yeah.
That's way better.
And so, Ace, how did you come here?
Military brat. So I've been a little bit of everywhere.
Fort Lee?
No, actually.
Is Fort Lee named for Lee?
I would imagine.
I believe
Is there a
it
different
Who else
Lee?
would it be named after?
That's a good point.
Quote me on that. Bruce Lee, maybe?
Yeah,
Bruce Lee.
That's probably right.
Yeah, right? So no, started up in DC, did Florida, came up, finished in Virginia Beach, and that is how I got to Richmond, by way of being an absolutely abysmal student throughout my entire academic career. I just had shit grades, and I didn't get into any of the prestigious universities I applied to. Certainly no Harvard boy.
Double. He's got 2 degrees from Harvard.
That's right.
See, the funny thing is, I was about to say I'll never
Put
let
double
you
in front of it, son.
Right, man. Put some respect on that. I was going to say I can never let you live that down, but in my experience, anyone who's gone to Harvard, make sure you don't forget it. So there's that.
He actually paid me to read those.
There we go. I was like, why didn't you pull up my bio? I had stuff on there and stuff.
They say, how do you know the Harvard guy? Don't worry, he'll tell you.
He'll tell you. There you go. Find out real quick, and I'll never let you forget. I had like a 2.9 coming out of high school, and there was only one rule. I wasn't allowed to go to ODU because it was too close to home. And my mom said if I got locked up, she'd have to drive across town to bail me out.
Really?
And
Your mother, that was her, if you get locked up, that was her fallback plan?
she said, you can't go to ODU. You're too close to home, and I don't want to have to drive across town to bail you out of jail.
Was this a thing that happened very frequently, that this was a...
No. Some run-ins with the cops. They were MPs growing up.
Okay,
right? I grew up on base.
All right, fair enough.
So MPs used to ball me up, and then my dad had ranked up. He did 30 years in the Coast Guard, trained naval officers. So they couldn't really do anything when they got me home. They're just like, well, all right. They just give the officer's kid back to him. But no, I wasn't properly a shithead. It was just, I just got in trouble.
I think we've all been arrested by the MPs from time to time.
Sometimes the MPs ball you up.
Hard growing up.
So I didn't get into the 4 schools I applied to. I was guaranteed into ODU, but wasn't allowed to go. And my best friend said, hey, I got into VCU. They've got rolling admissions. And this was like the last month of the summer after my senior year. And so I applied, got in, went to orientation like a week before school started. And I was very quickly a Richmonder. And it was just this, being in the city. I started in DC, ended in a city, have done a couple cities since then. Just being in an urban environment makes a lot more sense than being on base or in the suburbs, which was the entirety of my experience. Often the only black kid on the block, so on and so forth.
Even in a military base?
Probably more so there in everything you'd expect. It's a meritocracy. But I in my adult life heard some of the stories of my parents. They met at the Coast Guard Academy. Both grew up in abject poverty and decided to get out. And that was a really good way to do that. So they met at the Coast Guard Academy, and like just horror stories that I hear from being I think my mom was one of like a handful of women cadets and one of 3 or 4 black women cadets. And, you could count on fingers and toes how many black cadets there were across the academy. So it was just, early to mid 80s was when they were both there. And it was a whole thing. And that didn't change much in my experience growing up in officers' housing. It was the admirals and the commanders and, all of the people on base. We were often one of 2 or 3 families. Same happened when I moved to the suburbs down in Hampton Roads. I think there were 3 or 4 families in the neighborhood. And so there were 5 of us in my 5th grade class. And I remember that 4 of us rather, me, my neighbor, the kid from down the street, and then the kid who'd gotten kicked out of the school on the other side where all the black kids went. So it's just this wild experience growing up, mostly in the South. So getting up to Richmond was probably the most diverse that I got, which was really cool, framed a lot of things for me. But I don't think I thought twice about the monuments at any point. I don't think I considered what the monuments were really. But to Aaron's point, the stars and bars, flying out by the VMFA, that one was a gut punch. And, after I graduated, my dad was like, all right, so you're staying in Richmond, you're staying in the capital of the Confederacy. And he still gives me shit for it. So yeah, I left for 3 or 4 years. I'm more recently back to Richmond. And it feels really good as a home base, but we've missed the mark on a couple things. And I think we're having a real conversation finally about how we change or upgrade or remodel. And we can talk about remodeling at some point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
But yeah, that's me. I'm not from Richmond is the very short answer to a short question.
So as somebody who's from Virginia, and I grew up in a small town on the Virginia coast. And so Richmond was big city to me. And my small town was racist. It was just racist. Even living there as a child, you could tell it was racist. And so Richmond was very much not, right? Like clearly this is a very diverse cultural area of everybody likes each other and it's not racist at all. And the guys flying the Confederate flag and marching along are just part of the landscape. Like I never
thought about it.
Yeah, I don't know. That
didn't register.
That doesn't register as racist. It registers as,
right,
history.
Normal.
History.
Right.
I mean, I guess when people say history, It's normal, right?
And that's how it felt to you.
Yeah, until I started having friends who had moved in here and were like, "What the hell is wrong with your city?" And I'm like, "It's just. We're fine. What are you talking about?"
So you didn't think that Richmond was particularly racist?
I did not. So this is my question. So I never thought of Richmond being not from anywhere else except for a place that is more racist. I never considered Richmond to be
degrees of racism.
particularly racist, right? Until 3 weeks ago, I guess. And so the question, so how wrong am I about all of that?
It's hard to, it's not like the terror alert where it's like Richmond's a level orange on racism and, and Atlanta's
we don't have it down to
right,
that science.
right?
It's right.
But for me, the idea of some of these artifacts being so normalized in the landscape and nobody questioning them is a troubling indicator. And I remember when I lived in Atlanta, I remember when the state legislature was removing the stars and bars from their state flag. And I remember those debates, and I remember how heated they got in the 90s. And I remember seeing that and thinking like, that's really kind of messed up, because for me, with the stories that were handed down from my grandparents, that was mortal danger to them. That's a terrorist flag for them.
Right.
My grandfather was born in 1910 in Helena, Arkansas. When he was 9 years old, it was a summer called the Red Summer in 1919, where there was just a series of lynchings all around the country. And the fear and the pain that they carried was expressed in us in terms of being more aware of where danger might be and things that other people might not see, but they learned to see, because if they didn't, it would be fatal. And some of that you carry with you in that, when I see that big Trump flag on the highway, when I know that's not just you supporting a candidate, that's a signal.
Right.
When I see the stars and bars along, certain routes, I'm like, man.
It's like the racist Batman signal.
It is, right? It's like, man, don't break down your car here because this could be bad. Like that's a learned thing. And even if it's not acted out, like that's the sense. It's like, this is a terroristic threat, or could be interpreted to be. So I think for me, it's more processing that. But at the same time, I understand what Tara's saying, because when I was a kid, kid in my neighborhood had the Dukes of Hazzard big wheel, and I wanted the same one because I wanted to be like Bo and Duke. Didn't even process that they were riding around in the General Lee.
Right.
It was just like, that was cool. The Duke boys were the ones, right? So like these things can exist at a subconscious level that you don't even process, even when you should know better. So I completely understand that, but once you see them, you can't unsee them.
Yeah, I think back to 5th grade, maybe, in Western Branch, Virginia. So 5 minutes into Suffolk, 5 minutes into Portsmouth. Like, you could get shot at school. You just didn't know if it was somebody pulling it out of a waistband or their gun rack, right? Like, it was one of the two. And it wasn't that bad, but that was the, you just had a little bit of both. I remember we had Civil War Day in 5th grade, and you were supposed to dress up like you were from the Civil War. And what does that mean to anyone? So I remember, that
was not well thought out. I
That's
don't think.
new.
It was. So I remember my parents, my mom and I sat down. I think Dad was deployed, but Mom and I sat down, and she's like, "Okay, we got Civil War Day. How are you going to go?" And I was like, "Well, I might dress up like a general, this, that, and the third." And she's like, "Well, think about who you are and the society we exist in. How would you have fit into the culture then?" And I was like, "Shit." So my happy ass dressed up like a slave and went to Civil War Day.
Did you really?
I did. And it was awkward and uncomfortable for everyone but me. I was like, boom, I'm here. This is what it would have looked like then. It's what it looks like now.
Did you tell the teacher, did you say, this is what you get for coming up with this stupid ass assignment?
I didn't. And I wish my mom had given me carte blanche to curse the teacher out.
This is for you. This is what you get.
Right. But no, I mean, again, to Aaron's point, that normalization of this is where we grew up, right? This is the history, the legacy. This is what happened here, and let's have some educational, immersive experiences. But going out to the plantation to pick cotton and see what that was like. What are the optics there of 2 black kids in a class picking cotton, or dressing up like Confederate generals, and that wasn't the intent, right? It wasn't explicitly dress up like Confederate generals, but there's just so much desensitization there, I think, that created this interesting, not only opportunity, but we were numb to some of that.
So the idea that when Tara came, she thought of this as all that as sort of background noise was not. It was not just her experience. Everybody probably felt. I mean, so I came here from Chicago, and I didn't think anything of it. The statues never made any difference to me one way or the other until Charlottesville, when the Nazis wanted them up, and that's the point. You're like,
we're not going to be on the side.
We're not on the side of
whatever
Nazis.
side the Nazis are on. We're on the other side.
That's it.
Yeah.
But then after that, everything becomes, I don't know, more clear. I didn't know, for instance, that the Lee statue and all those statues were designed to sell segregated housing developments. Like that was the main thing. If you bought housing in this area, you had to say that no person of color would ever live there. That was why these statues were put up, and I didn't know any of that stuff.
Yeah, it was partially that, and partially the resurgence of the lost cause, and that ideology that came around. You had a lot of people putting money together to put these odes to a better time up, and they were meant to be imposing, and they were meant to be terroristic statements, and they were meant to be in the neighborhoods that were not meant for us. And I think that thing stood out when we had the privilege of moving up to Buffalo, got an investment for a past company, and you go through they have similar kind of flows in the city to Monument Avenue, very similar cities, Buffalo and Richmond, but they have General Bidwell instead of General Lee. They have first place trophies because they actually won. We've got consolation or participation trophies here. And I always knew that and didn't think much of it. I always thought it was dumb, but I wasn't offended. And you go see that, like, hey, we're actually honoring things that happened on the right side of history, I suppose. And you come back here, and for me, moving back to Richmond after being in Buffalo and St. Louis and New York City, just a very different, I think, relationship with the statues, making that move back.
I think when I learned that, what Ace just said, because these statues had been here, and I had assumed, since this was the seat of the Confederacy, that they were put up during those 5 or 6 years.
Right.
And that's what happened. So when I found out that these were put up 30, 40 years later, that's when my mind literally blew, because initially it was just like, wow, this is lazy. They don't want to take them down. I understand in a way, but it's kind of messed up that y'all keep them up. But then it's like, wait a second, because the argument was always, you can't scrub out the naughty bits and you got to have but I'm like, this wasn't even history. This would be literally like putting up a statue to a Nazi general 40 years after in the 80s.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that would, your intent at that point is absolutely clear. You're just dredging up a mess.
Right.
That's not history.
Yeah.
Right?
And also Longstreet, General Longstreet, there's no statues to Longstreet. Longstreet was Lee's number 2. And but after the war, he said we were fighting for the wrong things. And he became what was then a Republican, right? He became, he switched sides and decided that they had been wrong. And everyone hated him for it. And so the statues are very clearly, like the absence of Longstreet says a whole lot. Plus, like I said, there's the contracts for these plots of land here in Richmond were deliberately about excluding people. The thing about public art, and I want to change into this for a second, because I talked about art, it's interesting. Public art is never about art, and it's never about history. It's about the narrative. Who controls the narrative of the city? What do we represent? And those giant statues were terroristic. I mean, they were there to impose this new idea. And we have, rumors of war that went up was just spectacular because it's changing this narrative. And I guess my question is, a lot of what's happening in Richmond now is centered on these statues. And are we talking about the right things? Because as an art person, I think it's great, but I'm not sure this is the debate we should be having.
Whenever we'd open up a new car lots, we'd go to the original dealership and we'd find that there'd be a bunch of things that belonged to the old store. There'd be a big sales board that showed the top person. There'd be a salesman of the month plaque out front where they could park. There'd be all these cozy things that the dealer would have in his office. There'd be inappropriate nudie calendars in the service shop. There were the artifacts of what a traditional dealership could be. Not I won't say was, but could be, because clearly this happened enough that you would see it and say, like, these are the things. Right. And I keep the salesman of the month signs as a reminder that I don't want them in. We throw out the calendars. You got all those things out and you change it. And that's not where the work ends, but it's an important part of the work.
Right.
because those artifacts communicate the very thing. It's not, you can't just take those out and then everybody's great and it's a new dealership, right? It's a lot more than that. But it's a very important part. And when I hear people talk about these statues or flags or even Aunt Jemima on the syrup or Rastus on the cream and wheat box, that to me is all the same vein. It's like you can't say you're committed to tackling systemic racism and not understand the role that seeing terroristic statues, stereotypes in your kitchen all the time, looking at your kids, the tropes on TV, all of that stuff, man. Art is vitally important in that. And to that point, you know, my wife and I were at 1708 Gallery just before this all went down. And there was a Kehinde Wiley statue that was being up for auction. And you know, I went in with my budget and didn't think twice about it, but my wife said, that looks like it could be your cousin. That should be on your shelf. Like this is empowering. Like you should get that. And it was like that visceral feeling. And this is a statue this big, right? Not a towering statue on Monument Ave. That's the power that art, especially public art, has in all these different media. So I think this is absolutely the right conversation. It's just not the only conversation.
Is it cool seeing them covered in graffiti, or are you still like, just get them the hell out of here?
I think it's a good interim step. I'm definitely like, they're like bird droppings to me.
Well, Ace had this awesome post. Can you just say what that post was about?
If I remember it correctly, I said for those who advocated for adding context to the statues and the small background there, as we put together the Monument Commission here in Richmond, and we brought really educated scholars and community stakeholders together to study what we should do with the statues. And I believe those recommendations that came out where we should add context. And so I said to those who advocated for adding context to the monuments, we did the work for you yet again. Leave the graffiti or take down the monuments. Your move.
Yeah.
And it was a challenge, and I think I've been challenging a lot through all of this. So Aaron, I think nailed it. And the last piece he said, it is some of the work, it's not all of the work. I think it's a good first step. What I don't want is that we end up placated by the statues, or that we're trading horses here. And if we take down the statues, we don't have to do the real work. And that is what will happen very quickly. If this is the fight that we're having now, I would much rather keep the statues up and get the real shit done. If we have to choose, it's not a binary option there. But I think for a lot of folks, and the way that it's going to be, try to slip it in our drink at some point down the road is, well, we took the statues down. What do y'all want now?
Wow. Yeah.
And it's we want real change. We want not equality, it's equity, right? We can get to equality here, and it's going to feel like we got placated as well. Right? We got equality, and it's like, but the systemic issues that we've had for 400 years
still there.
Have put us so far behind the eight ball that giving us what you got now doesn't make sense, because y'all got way more. Y'all, the global y'all, got way more than we could ever aspire to have, based on all of the structure, the infrastructure, and the systemic issues that were introduced from square one, from the inception of our country. I wrote in a piece, the thing that's resonated most for me, and looking back at a piece that I wrote, as navel-gazing as that sounds, the analogy of, I'll hit that head on, the analogy that we keep calling for some remodeling of the house, right? We ought to remodel the house. It's broken. The foundation is cracked. No, the fuck it's not. The foundation is firmly, squarely intact. The foundation is built and designed exactly like it was supposed to, and it was designed to exclude us. Right. If we can't remodel the house on a flawed foundation, that's a bunch of bullshit work, and that's how I feel about it. I was raised by two sailors. I swear, like one.
Right, that's fine. That's fine.
But yeah, that's how I feel. And if it's just the monuments, somebody pulled the wool over our eyes, and I don't care for it because, we're smarter than that.
I hope so. I'm not. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that we are. I read a thing just this morning, actually, about the history of colonialism, like this idea, racism, the idea of black as the idea that of races actually goes back to the colonial work in Great Britain. So when England was colonializing India and Africa and all this sort of stuff, they had to come up because they did horrible.
I like everything that involves it all being Britain's fault. Anytime the answer is it's completely Britain's fault, I like that. That's
but they had, I mean, in order to do these horrific things, like Auschwitz level horrific types of things, they had to come up with a narrative that these people deserved it. So they had to be different, right? They had to be foreign, and so this idea of some groups being lesser than others actually was a deliberate. It's not a bug. It's a feature. Right, it's built into the way the power is structured. So we got that going for us,
and that tracks though, right? Because this idea of other, what we realized here in America is even when we started sorting out the civil rights, and we got not even civil rights yet, but like we got rid of slavery. We realized at some point it's often economic, right? Colonialism came from a land grab. We started stealing stuff from Africa because it was a land grab, right? Like all of the things that have led to this point where we've got this built-in inequity. And, when we realized it was about money, and I don't think that was an epiphany, that's where we started. That's why we all started doing stuff, is money and power. When we got to a point here domestically and said, we can have this idea of race, and that's been built in because we had slavery. But we got to a point where we said, as rich folks, the bourgeois of America, said, there are poor people, and there are a lot more poor people than there are rich folks. And if we create this idea of other between poor whites and poor blacks, they won't realize that they got more in common than they don't, and will end up getting together because their social status and the socioeconomic indicators that ruled their lives would have been more of a unifying factor than anything else. So we reintroduced this idea of race as other, and that drove a wedge between, it's the same uneducated folks on both sides who are killing each other, right? Like we know that white folks kill white folks more than anyone else, and black folks do the same. We've got racism, and we've got ignorance, and we've got all of those things that proliferate both of those communities, a lot of similarities, but we've driven this wedge of race between the two. And that has kept us in the place that we are in a lot of respects. But again, not a bug, a feature. That was by design.
Right. So bringing it back from the history back to now, you came to Richmond, you were hit in the face with, this weirdness, but then it was subsumed under as just background noise. What's it like now? How does it feel to you now going through the streets? I get kind of a kick out of watching the city change. I mean, there's an undercurrent of lawlessness, but it's not really lawlessness. This is the root of democracy. I mean, this is how this works. What's it feel like for you?
I wouldn't say that that it was ever subsumed in the background for me. I think it just became a low and steady boil of like, this is a part of this place. And for me, again, not just because I think our artifacts are important, but also just personally, this is some important healing work for me to see these things get taken down, to have these types of conversations. I don't have to agree with everyone, and I don't expect everyone else to be as excited about it as I am. And that's fine. But for me personally, that takes some bandwidth.
Right.
It takes bandwidth in terms of how well you can identify with a place, your sense of personal and emotional safety, how well you can connect. I mean, some of that stuff, rooting it out is just really important. So for me, I'm glad to be at this place, and I think that this sets a more fertile ground for us to have the more important conversations and do the more important work. But it was never just background noise for me, or it never really got to that point. And I'm glad that I don't have to have it as any noise, hopefully, in the near future.
So is it exhausting, or is it invigorating?
It's invigorating for me, because this is finally a level of engagement where these things have been outed, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, this is a conversation I would have had if you were willing to listen, or you being the collective you, 8 or 9 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
But what would happen then is, well, yeah, I hear you, but my great grandfather this, and they're like, okay, cool, that's exhausting, right? Like, because nobody even, or if you're agnostic to them, and it's like, you're just not not a part of your background. There's this educational exercise that's equally exhausting. But now we're at this place where people are like, never thought of it that way. Let's talk about it. Like, that's invigorating. And I think Ace is right. Something he said earlier, like how big is this window and how long will it last? Are people genuinely interested in this stuff, or is it just a sexy thing of the day because you're locked up at home all day and you can't do anything else? But I'm hopeful. And if nothing else, at least there was a window where I could get it off my chest and talk about it, even if it closes, which I hope it doesn't. But even if it does, this is some good work that could get done.
Do you think the window's going to close?
Definitely. I think the hope, and that's not the pessimist in me. I think that's just the realist that, this is exhausting work, but the window for me, exhausting for the greater community, I think, because it's hard. It's a level of awareness you didn't have before. And then suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, this is really noisy and it's loud and it's heavy. And if you haven't been conditioned to deal with it, then you might not be built for it right away. But I don't think the window means that like, hey, this is it. And then it closes and everybody goes back to where they were. I think this is a window for us to take the conversation from here, this base level stuff where we're just talking about things that sound like basic human rights and shouldn't even be debates.
Right.
And take it to at least another point. And there'll be other things, right? And there'll be other things that compel us to keep pushing the conversation out. There'll be other tipping points. There'll be other kindling sticks and everything else, whether we want them or not. But I think that this is the opportunity to advance the conversation in this window as far as we possibly can with as many people as we possibly can. And I think to Ace's earlier point, to drive real action in this moment. But yeah, I don't think it's just a free. I can already see people. I was on a call this morning and people were like, "Oh, first COVID, now this." I'm like, what do you mean now this? This ain't just a thing.
You know what they, you know exactly what they mean now this.
It's like, it's like this is people's livelihoods out here. And it's like I'm hearing people talk about it. They're inconvenienced and they're annoyed with it already. Like, look, we got it. Take her off the syrup or don't. I don't care. But can we get back to work, please? Like, no, like that's not what this is.
But we don't go backwards from the forward momentum slows and then stops at some point. But they're going to take those statues down. They're never going to put them back up, right? Like they're going to change the names of the high schools. They're never going to change them back. They're never going to put Aunt Jemima back on like to some extent they are moving. You're changing the level of the conversation from here to here.
That's exactly what.
So
yeah, I think that's the hope, right?
The police funding will eventually slide back to more of police. Right. But some of the stuff you don't, once you've made the, once you,
you don't go back.
You don't say, you know what we need? We need more statues of Robert E. Lee. Turns out we were wrong to take them down. We should put up more. Like they're never going to do that, right?
Well, yeah, but to Ace's point, right, if we get the statues down and we're like, oh, that was it. That was what we were done, right? We're done with that. And now we can get back to work.
Those kids who are out in front of the police station every night aren't going to let them give up at that, if nothing else.
I'll push back a little bit there, right? Because I think for every step we take forward, it feels like a zero-sum game to I was going to say the other part. It's the white community feels like we're getting something that means they're losing something. And that has been the debate for most of the time we've been talking about race. If we're, and the something has always been articulated as that, it's power. Like, let's put a word on it, right? Like, you're losing power if I get some rights.
In an absolute sense, I suppose.
Right. And that is how it feels. It ought not be that, right? It's not a zero-sum game to get to equity. But that is how it has been framed. And so I think for every step or every win that we get, the statues come down, we defund the police, so on and so forth, we're creating this void that I think has been filled with a lot of the political rhetoric that we've seen and what Trump has created in our current political climate. I was standing on Monument the other day doing some filming. So we were filming in front of a buddy of mine has a public TV show, wanted to get footage before the monument came down in the same way you guys did the tour with the kids. And as we're there, see a guy in a Lexus drive by, full suit, tie, going downtown. We're in the middle of a pandemic, which means he's a lawyer or a banker in Richmond, right? Older, had to be probably late 60s. And he yells, "Go to work."
Wow.
To us as we're on Monument Avenue at General Lee statue. That type of stuff we're seeing more and more of Will Smith said appropriately, racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed, or something to that effect.
Nice.
And I thought that was put well. But I'm seeing this very acute emboldening of folks who can't wrap their head around this perceived loss of power. So to say that the momentum is heading in the right direction, I'd entirely agree with that. But we're seeing some nastiness rear its head right now.
Backlash.
It's black. There is a lash for sure. And it's coming from the communities that, as entrepreneurs in Richmond, I won't speak for Aaron. I know that I end up in the room with a lot of the people who don't look like me. I'm often the only black guy in the room. And a lot of these people are the kingmakers in town. In response to a lot of this, I'm having friends that I've known for a decade say, I finally get it now. And there's this expectation that I offer thanks. And it's like, if you get it now, if this is changing everything, what did the last 10 years of our relationship mean? How did you see me then for 9.5 years leading up to this point? What was our dynamic if this changes everything? And I think you're hearing people put words to that in a way that is wildly uncomfortable, overly unnecessary, but is true. And that to me, I think there's some cognitive dissonance there for me, if you will.
I think for me, slightly different take. It's much more. There are some arguments for just basic human decency that have been on the table for a long time that seem obvious, but now people seem to be getting that argument in a different way, like in a human way, right? So everybody's not. And I think I take that point 100%. I saw this. So if you haven't picked up, this Aunt Jemima thing's a big deal to me.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother used to keep the old boxes as almost like her own version of like, look at this. This is what she used to look like. And she would be, she was full on mammy stereotype.
They didn't change it all that long ago, did they? I remember the old boxes, but I was surprised when I saw the new one. I was like,
I'm talking about she had the ones from the early 1900s, big eyes, like the whole, like,
red lips,
and the full minstrel.
The minstrel. So it was the full on Gone with the Wind, Eyes Be Making Buckwheats, and like the whole ads. She kept all that stuff. She, that was like her own, just to remind the kids, like, this is what they think.
So she kept that to teach you that this was the way the world was.
Yeah, it's like this was the education. And it's like when I see the announcement from Quaker and from Pepsi and all these, I think which is a good thing. I agree with Ace. It's not sufficient. I think it's necessary.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a good step. But then you read the comments and somebody says,
"Don't read the comments."
Now they're going too far.
Don't read the comments.
Right now, why they got to do this? And it's just like and again, like, how does that hurt? If you're just a consumer of syrup, white, black, yellow, polka dot stripes, it doesn't hurt you. It hurt me when she was on there.
Right.
If she comes off, it doesn't hurt you. Why is this even the conversation? Like, this is such an easy give.
Right.
This shouldn't even be a part. But I think this is what Ace is saying. Like, this, if you think this is a chip in a horse trade, this is nothing.
Right.
This shouldn't have never happened.
Right.
So the governor
at zeros
said
after we get this done.
Right?
Like, we're starting after this.
That's a deficit.
Right.
Like, finally, after 120 years of agitation, you decide I'll take it off.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a horse trade. No,
I saw a great meme. It was like, look, if removing the statues changes your way of life,
you're a pigeon.
You're either a racist or a pigeon, right? And I was like, very simply said, and memes have a place in popular culture. But I thought that one was apt for where we are right now.
So the governor said this week, when in announcing Juneteenth, he said it's just symbolic, but symbols are really important. If they weren't, then y'all wouldn't be fighting so hard to keep from taking down monuments and flags. And I keep thinking about that with the syrup, which is like, if the symbol wasn't important, y'all wouldn't be losing your mind.
That's the irony, right? It's like you are so upset about a logo.
Yeah, this is clearly really important to you in a really disturbing way.
What I can't get is, the version of masculinity that I was raised in was you don't complain. You say, all right, this is how it is. I move forward. Because you have power doesn't diminish my power at all. That was the version of
Aaron doesn't want to say white supremacists are pussies, but that's what he means.
They're total pussies. They're absolute pussies because, why are you whining? You grew up your whole life saying you weren't supposed to whine, and now you're whining about the things?
I need to disapprove of you calling them pussies, even though I just did it first.
We shouldn't use misogyny to beat down racism.
That's why he doesn't want to say it, because he knows I'd whap him if he had said it first. But since I said it first,
but it's to your point.
Baited you.
Yeah,
it's to your point. Why are you complaining about this? How does this impact you at all? I don't. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about symbolism is we all believe that, right? Like we all believe that symbols mean something, and it's often the America's the greatest, support our troops, support our police. Those flag waving, love our country nationalists that are most upset by the symbolism. They're the same ones who are loving the fact that we pulled Saddam's statue down
right
as soon as we finished our work there. Right. We were barely finished and we're pulling the statue down because it meant something.
Right.
We're having the argument there, and there's an intellectual dishonesty, right? Like that I miss. If somebody's like, we should have left Saddam out too. I'm like, all right, well, those are the folks that I'd be like, all right, you're at least consistent, and that's a virtue. I'll give you that.
Right.
But I have yet to find somebody who's like, we should leave all of them up. Hitler should be up too.
They're not that smart. Right? They're not that smart.
I agree.
The logical thing is not
that for me. I won't go on my education soapbox, but we ought to teach logic and rhetoric so we can actually have conversations. That'd be crazy.
So for me, as a white Southern girl from here, I've started trying to put words on my feelings because I realized I cannot possibly logic this out. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense, and it's wrong. But I think the word I want is nostalgic for those statues and for my because I remember them from my childhood. I remember my childhood fondly. I remember being on. So I think being able to recognize for me the word,
there is some loss.
There's some loss, which does not matter in terms of public policy and what is good for the city as a whole and what is good for the entire community of the city. Not like my feelings are not actually that important in this. So, but being able to recognize, I think what I mean is nostalgia for the old syrup bottles somehow that we, I think what you're talking about is some
you had a thing about the mall.
Cloverleaf Mall. Yeah. So when I was a kid, there was a mall here called Cloverleaf Mall. It was over in Chesterfield. And we went to the mall, and over time it went the way of malls. People stopped going. It became unused. It fell into disrepair, and they tore it down. And now when people say, "Oh, remember Cloverleaf Mall?" I have this feeling of nostalgia, but it's not like I think you shouldn't have taken the mall down. You should put the mall back. Like, what is this world coming to that we took? It's just I don't know. It's a
thing.
It's a thing from childhood, and I think the monuments and the flags and the things from your childhood that you don't have bad memories of.
Right.
You've kind of.
It's our natural aversion to change, right? There's a fear there, and I think when we talk about empathy, I know Aaron, you talk about empathy a lot. As well, that empathetic bone.
When I talk about it, I don't have to listen. That's really why I do it.
No, it's a tough thing. So that same experience out filming at the monument, there was a guy behind us as we were filming, and he was right in frame scrubbing with a scrub brush and bleach.
Was the kid on the sidewalk on his hands and knees? It
was an older gentleman.
Okay.
I mean,
he was that guy.
Vietnam hat on, and he had a cane. Mm-hmm. He had his brush in his bucket, and he was just wheezing in the heat. It was hot. And, I laugh and I shake my head, and I have this feeling about that dummy scrubbing down the monument. Yeah. He's offended more by the F-bomb than the fact that General Lee's, in the middle of our city. But if you take a step past that towards empathy, not excusing, I say I get it, but it's not okay.
Right.
I'm so used to saying I get it. I just started adding but it's not okay. And that's my journey.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That empathetic piece said there is a fear here for him, huffing and puffing in the heat, looked like he's about to fall out, cleaning a thing because he cares so much about that and is afraid of something. Right. I wanted to go sit in the shade with him and ask him his name and have a conversation. And I didn't get the chance to do that, unfortunately. And I drive by and kind of keep an eye out because I'd still love to do it.
We know his name and his home address and his phone number, by the way.
Well, that's doxing. Don't do that.
I didn't say we're giving it out freely. I'm just saying we got all their names.
We're not doing that.
but yeah, that's kind of the point for me. If you take a step past that, there is a fear, and it happens in Middle America, and a lot of the folks who voted for Trump and the folks who are defending the monuments. There's some of them are just racist. Right? But some of them are scared of losing something. And there's a core of that fear to get to. Maybe that doesn't change anything, but helps to understand that your fear of losing a thing is my fear of the police. And we cannot equate the two, but we can talk about fear in a really open, honest, candid way. And maybe that starts shifting some perspective.
Yeah, but my fear of losing something doesn't, if that comes true, I lose a thing. If the police shoot you, you die, right? It's not quite the same.
No, but you find the common ground to talk about.
Yeah.
Fear was the only point there.
Yeah.
You cannot equate the two. My life and your statue are not the same thing, right? That's a real conversation to have.
And that's what makes these conversations so complicated, right? Because the statue didn't shoot anybody. These things, they kind of get tossed in the same bucket because they're related, but they're not the same. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's hard, because if you're trying to engage somebody on that level and talk about why this hurts you, they're going to say, again, you go back to the bad apple argument, you go back to others, and then you're back where you started and everybody's confused and you give up and you go home. And I think that's what, going back to the point about this window, I think that's one thing. I feel there's more empathy in this moment for people to at least understand, okay, I'm not going to do the false equivalency thing universally. I'm not going to talk you down. Talk to me some more about why does the statue bother you so much, and what's going on with you and the cops? Because these perceptions exist in parallel. And they're all real. They're just different sides of the same thing. I remember I was telling a story to a friend. I got pulled over by the cops when I was going to high school, and the cop pulled me over, started quizzing me about where I'm going, asked me a million questions, like, well, who's your coach? What, and just grilling me. And finally lets me go, and I go to school. And I tell the principal actually, and he says, what did you do? I mean, you must have done something, because the cop, they don't just pull people over like that. I'm like, yeah, that's totally what happened. I was just walking. He said, did you have your headphones in? Did you have your uniform on? And he's trying to figure out what made me a threat in that moment, because cops just wouldn't do it. That was his reality. I talked to the headmaster. I tell him the same story. He says, that's bull. That cop's a bad apple. We're going to the Grosse Pointe Park, and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to talk to the mayor, and I'm going to get him on the phone. And that's the deal. And that was his reality. This was a guy who showed bad judgment. I told my grandfather the story when I got home, and he said, you're lucky you came back alive. Don't be mouthing off to the cops. And that was his reality. I don't think any of them were wrong, right? They're just different. And that's the part that's hard to wrestle around, because it's not black life, blue life, whatever. It's reality. And empathy is the only thing that's going to bring you to that table to have those conversations. Yeah.
The problem, this bad apple thing is the major problem, because it's not a few bad apples. It's a systemic thing. And that's the harder discussion to have, right? That all those realities can be true, and that it's the underlying structure that we need to address.
Yep.
I think maybe what's interesting in this conversation, the tenor of the conversation right now is we're asking for absolutes.
Right.
I don't think that's wrong. From a negotiation standpoint, that's a good first position, right? Because we're never going to get the first thing we asked for. So if it's defund all the cops and they're all bad and take all the statues down, I don't think it's meant as a first position. But if we're being really practical about where we end up, it will not be what we're asking for today.
Right. So
perhaps
go ahead and ask for a lot.
Sure.
But land grab now.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we get walked back, we have something that's actually tangible and changes the way we're able to exist in society. Again, I'm not giving everybody all of the credit that is how it's been thought through, but I think that'll be the practical reality where we end up.
The guy from SNL has a routine about this. He says it was a bad negotiating tactic. Black Lives Matter is a bad place to start. Matter, right? Just matters. what's less than matter?
Right.
Right. It's not even equal rights. It's civil rights.
Yeah.
Civil. Can we just turn the hose off?
Michael Shea killed that one.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So let's wrap this up. So by way of wrapping this up, predict the future for me. Do the good guys win, or do the bad guys win?
I mean, this is why you have 9 Star Wars, right? It's like you think one side wins, and then they come back with another one. You think the other side wins. This is the ebb and flow. I mean, I think it's a sine wave, but I think it's trending up and to the right, but it's still a sine curve. I mean, some of these things are things that we thought we had buried and dealt with 10 years ago. And some people on different sides of the argument will tell you, like, we had a black president, we had this, like,
Right.
things were good. We figured this out, didn't we? And it's like, nah, we really didn't.
I remember doing a lecture when Obama had his. Do you remember when his preacher said something and he gave a
The
speech
best
on race?
speech
He gave the
ever
speech
written.
on race.
Yeah.
And I made all my students listen to it because I thought this would go down as history as one of the defining moments. That this was the moment that we were finally going to talk about this. And what I remember telling the students is I said, this doesn't change everything, but it's different. The world is different now. And it turns out I was wrong.
It was a really good speech.
It was a really good speech. But what I thought the world was different now, and it turns out it's a sine wave. It is not different.
Right.
So do we win? Do the good guys win?
I think that curve continues for all time. I don't think, listen, if we like this, and to Ace's point, if these are things that are rooted in economics and self-interest, and we've got a lot of work to do as a human species on a lot of things. This isn't the only issue. It's a big one. It's the one. It's the one I care about the most right now. But it's not the only one. So I think making some traction here in this moment is a big ask. But I think it's a reasonable ask, and it's a good aspiration on its own. I think projecting into a future where it's all love and harmony is probably overly optimistic for me. But I think expecting continual progression along that sine curve, that it keeps doing this, but along an upward trajectory, is reasonable. And that's my hope, is that we're going to keep stumbling and falling down, but we're going to fall down in different places than we did before.
Yeah, I don't think anyone wins ever. But I think we're heading in the right direction. And I am the consummate optimist. I will put that on record. Always am. But I think the realism here says we'll always have the ebbs and flows, like the sine wave analogy. I call it the pendulum swing. Like, we just tend as humans to overcorrect.
Because sine wave has math involved. I'm still reeling from the fact that he's had math since
I like
high
it
school.
because a pendulum just comes back to the same
Right.
spot, right? A sine wave has some
It's
progression.
a Harvard analogy versus.
I didn't say it. I thought it when you first said sine curve. But I didn't. That was you, man. Your word.
That's a little improv. Come all the way back down to the middle. All right, so I think we're going to end there.
I love it.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you.
This was awesome. And so everyone listening, go to reinventionpodcast.com for transcripts and other free resources. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Turn
you.
this off, see if it works.